Chapter 1. The Son Who Learned Silence in the First Age. Before temples had names, before mortals could count seasons, there was only the raw shape of power. Kronos ruled then, not as a king who listened, but as a force that crushed questions before they formed. He had taken the throne by violence, and he kept it by fear. The prophecy that stalked him was simple. One of his children would end him, the way he ended his own father. Kronos did not search for wisdom to escape fate. He searched for a stomach deep enough to hide it. Hades was born into that shadow. Some stories paint him as darkness from the cradle, as if he arrived already wearing the underworld like a crown. But the earliest truth is harsher and more human, even for a god. He was born a son of Kronos and Rhea, and he was greeted not with celebration, but with calculation. His first breath was measured by a tyrant who already decided his last. Kronos swallowed him. No lullaby. No mother's arms. No sky. Only the crushing inside of a god who feared the future more than he loved his blood. Inside Kronos, time did not move. It churned. It pressed. It suffocated. Hades did not grow the way mortals grow, surrounded by light and language. He grew in a prison made of flesh and prophecy. He learned what most rulers never learn until the end. He learned what power feels like when it is absolute, and what it feels like when you are helpless beneath it. He was not alone for long. One by one, his siblings were taken into the same darkness. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Poseidon. The family became a silent constellation trapped inside a living cage. They did not see one another with eyes, but gods are older than sight. They felt one another. They learned to recognize each other by presence, by the tremor of fear, by the steady burn of anger. Hades learned the first lesson that shaped him more than any battle. Endurance. Not the endurance of the athlete. Not the endurance of the soldier with a song on his lips. This was endurance without hope. Endurance that tasted like iron. Endurance that did not expect rescue, and therefore did not break when rescue delayed. In that darkness, Hades learned to speak without speaking. A slight shift of will, a pulse of defiance, a shared understanding that passed between imprisoned gods like a secret current. If Kronos thought he had silenced them, he was wrong. He had only forced them to learn a deeper language. And Hades learned something else. He learned the shape of a tyrant from the inside. Kronos was not only a ruler. He was a fear wearing a crown. The kind of fear that devours its own future. The kind of fear that becomes cruel because it cannot become safe. Hades felt that fear around him every moment. It was the walls. It was the ceiling. It was the air. And he understood, long before Zeus ever lifted a thunderbolt, that tyranny is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is simply the decision that another life does not matter. Years passed that cannot be measured. Ages flowed without stars. Then beyond the prison, something changed. A new presence appeared in the world, bright and sharp. Not inside the darkness, but outside it. A younger sibling who breathed free air. Zeus. Rhea hid him, and the earth itself assisted her. The baby grew in secret, and secrecy is its own kind of weapon. Zeus learned speed and persuasion. He learned how to gather allies. He learned how to tell a story so powerful that even beings older than time would listen. Hades did not hear Zeus speak. He felt Zeus, like a distant storm arriving. And then came the day the prison convulsed. Zeus returned, grown and armed with cunning. He did not free his siblings with tenderness. He freed them with violence. Kronos was forced to vomit the children he tried to erase. The gods emerged into the light like truths a tyrant could no longer swallow. Hades was among them. Imagine it. A god who has existed for ages in darkness suddenly under the vast sky. The air itself would feel like an enemy. The brightness would feel like a threat. The wind would feel like a blade. Many would flinch. Many would rage. Many would weep. Hades did none of these. He simply looked. He looked at the sky and did not worship it. He looked at the earth and did not trust it. He looked at Kronos and did not beg. He looked at Zeus, the brother who had never known the prison, and he did not bow. There was no speech, no grand embrace, no dramatic vow declared to the heavens. But in Hades' silence, the world felt a promise form like a stone settling into place. No one would ever swallow him again. The war began almost immediately. Freedom was not a gift. It was a door that opened into fire. Zeus wanted the throne because the throne was the solution to the terror behind them. Poseidon wanted the fight because the fight was the proof of strength. Hades wanted neither the speech nor the spectacle. Hades wanted certainty. He wanted a world where a father could not decide that his children were disposable. He wanted a world where power could not hide inside fear and call itself fate. He did not speak these desires aloud. He did not have to. His eyes carried them, dark and steady, like deep water that has never seen the sun. When the brothers and their allies gathered, the world listened. The Titans had ruled for ages, and they did not intend to step aside for children they once dismissed. Mountains cracked. Seas shuddered. The air filled with the language of war. And Hades took his place. Not in front, where applause would be loudest. Not behind, where safety would tempt weakness. He stood where the battle would be decided, because Hades had already survived the worst thing a god can endure. He had survived being erased while still alive, and now he would teach the universe what it meant to resist. Chapter 2. The War That Made Brothers, and the War That Changed Them. The first battle did not begin with a trumpet. It began with a tremor. The Titans had ruled too long to be surprised by rebellion, but they were surprised by one detail. The children they swallowed were not broken. They were sharpened. Zeus called the sky to his side. His voice carried across the raw world like an oath made of thunder. When he spoke, even stone seemed to pause and listen, as if the earth itself could sense a new authority learning how to breathe. Poseidon stood near him like a storm held in a fist. There was salt in Poseidon's spirit even then, even before the sea truly belonged to him. He craved impact, proof, the kind of victory you can taste. He wanted the Titans to feel fear the way they once made others feel it. Hades stood with them, and yet apart. Not distant in loyalty, distant in nature. Zeus was fire that rises. Poseidon was force that crashes. Hades was something older in its calm, the quiet pressure that never stops, the certainty that the deepest places do not need to shout to be feared. When the war became real, the world discovered quickly that courage was not enough. The Titans were not merely strong. They were elemental. They were the architecture of the old order. They were the mountains before mountains had names. To fight them, the brothers needed more than rage. They needed tools, alliances, and a kind of intelligence that could survive centuries of grinding conflict. So Zeus did what future kings always do. He went into the hidden places of the world and freed the ones his enemies had locked away. The Cyclopes, the one-eyed smiths, were released from their confinement. The 100-handed ones were released as well, those vast beings with strength that seemed impossible, as if the universe itself had grown extra arms just to tear chains apart. And in gratitude, the Cyclopes forged gifts. For Zeus, lightning that would obey his will and make the sky a weapon. For Poseidon, a trident that could split water and stone and command the deep. For Hades, a helm that could hide him from sight. Many hear of that helm and misunderstand. They imagine Fear. They imagine a god who wants to avoid the risk of being seen. They imagine a shadow that refuses to stand in the open. But invisibility is not hiding. Invisibility is strategy. Hades did not want an audience. He wanted outcomes. He wanted to end a war, not perform inside it. The helm gave him what Kronos never allowed him inside that living prison. Control over the moment when he could be reached. Control over whether an enemy could even find the shape of his intention. In war, that kind of control is a blade. The Titanomachy was not one great clash. It was a long, grinding war of sieges and ambushes, of alliances shifting like tectonic plates. It tore scars into the earth that would last through future ages. Mountains were thrown like insults. Rivers changed their courses because a giant fell in the wrong place. The sky itself learned new sounds. Zeus struck from above with terrible clarity. When he entered a fight, there was no confusion about what was happening. The sky became a courtroom, and his lightning was the verdict. Poseidon fought like a disaster, given purpose. He did not simply defeat enemies. He shattered their confidence. He made the ground unsafe. He made the air taste like panic. And Hades moved through it all like a certainty that had chosen patience. He did not announce his arrival. He did not demand recognition. He appeared where an enemy's certainty was strongest. A Titan would raise a wall of stone as a shield, believing himself safe because no army could cross it in time. Then the Titan would feel a cold pressure behind his ribs, the sensation of being observed by something that did not blink. The Titan would turn. There would be nothing. And then the Titan would fall, not always from a wound, but from the sudden collapse of confidence. Hades learned the art of fear as a weapon, not as an emotion. That is the line people forget. Hades did not enjoy terror because he was cruel by nature. He understood terror because it was the language Kronos used to rule. Hades had lived inside the throat of tyranny. He knew the taste of helplessness. He knew the moment when you realize no one is coming. And he knew that if you can place that moment inside an enemy, you do not have to break them with brute force. You break them from within. There were those among the gods and allies who whispered that Hades fought too coldly, that his methods were harsh, that he was becoming like the darkness he had endured. Hades heard the whispers and did not respond. He had no patience for moral performances during a war for existence, because the Titans did not fight cleanly either. They fought like rulers who believed the world belonged to them by default. They punished rebellion with spectacle. They crushed lesser beings who stood in the wrong place. They made examples out of anyone who hesitated to kneel. They called it order. Hades knew what that word meant. Order was what Kronos claimed when he swallowed his children. Order was what tyrants call their hunger. So Hades refused to soften. In the middle years of the war, there came a moment that revealed the difference between the three brothers more clearly than any speech ever could. A Titan stronghold fell after a siege that lasted an age. The allied forces celebrated. Many expected mercy. They expected Zeus to present himself as a better ruler than Kronos by sparing the defeated. Zeus hesitated. Zeus had a king's mind even then, always balancing power with image, always considering how a decision would echo in the ages. He was not cruel by instinct, but he was not merciful by instinct either. Zeus was a ruler learning the cost of choices. Poseidon demanded punishment. He wanted the defeated to feel the same fear they had inflicted on others. He wanted to carve victory into the world so deeply that no one would dare to challenge the new order. And Hades watched both of them, silent, patient. Then Hades said something that stunned even the 100-handed ones. Mercy is not what ends a tyrant's age. A cage does. It was not a threat. It was a conclusion. The Titans could not simply be defeated and released. Not if the new world was to survive. Not if children were to grow under a sky that did not swallow them. Hades argued for permanence. Zeus listened, because Zeus understood one truth that rulers learned too late. A battle ends when swords stop moving. A war ends when the defeated cannot return. The decision was made. The Titans would be imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest pit. A place so far below the world that even light seemed to forget it existed. That was the first-rate injustice some later poets laid at Hades' feet. They called it cruelty. They called it vengeance. They called it merciless. Hades did not deny any of it. He did not deny it because he saw it differently. To Hades, it was not vengeance. It was prevention. Kronos had proven what happens when you let fear rule. Fear devours. Fear returns. Fear repeats itself. If the Titans were allowed to rise again, they would not return wiser. They would return hungrier, and the world would bleed again. So the prison was built. The 100-handed ones became the wardens. Chains were laid into the architecture of the deep. Gates were placed that would not open to charm or bribery. Zeus' lightning sealed the verdict. Poseidon's force reinforced the boundaries. And Hades, quiet as an eclipse, learned the geography of confinement better than any of them, because confinement was the first landscape he ever truly knew. When Kronos was dragged down, when the Titans fell, the war ended with a silence so vast it felt like a new kind of sky. And in that silence, the brothers stood together. They had won. But victory has a way of creating a second war, one that begins inside the mind. Now there was a throne to divide. Now there was a cosmos to govern. Now there were mortals who would someday pray and demand explanations. Now there were laws to make, borders to draw, and domains to claim. Zeus looked upward. He always looked upward. He wanted the highest seat because he believed, perhaps correctly, that the highest seat would keep the world from falling back into the old hunger. Poseidon looked outward. He wanted a realm that could move, roar, and expand. Something that could answer his restless spirit. Hades looked downward, not because he feared the sky, because he remembered the pit. Hades did not want the throne of Olympus. He did not want the applause of clouds. He did not want to be the bright face of the new order. He wanted something else. He wanted the one realm that no one else wanted, the realm that would never have songs written in its honor by happy mouths, the realm that would not be loved, the realm that would be necessary. There is a kind of courage that charges into a battlefield. There is another kind that walks willingly into loneliness and locks the door behind itself. Hades chose the second. But the choice was not given with tenderness. The division of the cosmos was not a perfect conversation between brothers who loved each other. It was a negotiation shaped by exhaustion, pride, and the hidden bruises of a war that lasted too long. Lots were drawn in some tellings. Agreements were made in others. The truth is that myth remembers outcomes more than meetings. Zeus received the sky. Poseidon received the sea. Hades received the underworld, a realm beneath the earth, the unseen foundation of life and death. To many, it seemed like Hades lost. Even among gods, there were glances that carried pity, as if Hades had been assigned a punishment rather than a kingdom. Hades did not correct them. He did not explain that the underworld was not a consolation prize. It was the most absolute domain. The sky can be challenged by another storm. The sea can be crossed by another ship. But death is the one border no one negotiates with for long. Death is the final law, the final boundary, the last authority, and Hades would be its ruler. Still, the underworld was not only a throne. It was a sentence. He would not walk among festivals. He would not be welcomed in marketplaces. He would not be praised by mortals who feared him even when they needed him. He would be spoken of in lowered voices. He would be blamed for endings he did not cause. The dead would come to him, not because he hunted them, but because the universe required a place for them to go. Hades accepted it. And with that acceptance, another part of him hardened. Not into evil, into necessity. If Zeus was the visible order and Poseidon the wild force, then Hades would be the rule beneath rules. The structure that holds endings. The judge who does not smile. The keeper who cannot afford to be sentimental. Because if the underworld was poorly governed, the world above would rot. The first steps into his realm were quiet. He descended not as a celebrant, but as a builder. He shaped the halls where the dead would gather. He established boundaries so the living could not simply wander in and take what they pleased. He raised the gates, not to be cruel, but to be sure that the world had a spine. Then came the first visitors. Not heroes, not poets, not lovers seeking romance in the dark. The dead. Shadows that arrived confused, pleading, angry, grieving, silent. And Hades sat in the center of it all like a dark star, holding the weight of endings so that the world above could pretend endings were far away. He had won a war. Now, he began the work that no song ever wanted to celebrate. Chapter 3. The Kingdom No One Wanted. And the king who made it law the underworld was not born as a palace. It was born as a function. Before Hades gave it shape, it was an idea the universe carried in its bones. A downward pull, a final silence. A place that existed because life cannot keep everything it creates. When Hades entered his realm, he did not arrive to admire it. He arrived to organize it. Above, the sky was loud with Zeus's new order. Storms became messages. Oaths became lightning. On the seas, Poseidon's moods wrote themselves into the waves. The world could see their power. Mortals could point at the horizon and say, "There is the proof." But the underworld offered no proof. It only offered absence. Hades understood that absence is dangerous when left ungoverned. A place without law becomes a wound. A wound invites infection. If death was a border, then the border needed walls, gates, judges, and rules that could not be bribed by tears. So Hades began with structure. He carved regions within the darkness, not for beauty, but for clarity. There were fields for the ordinary dead, the countless many who lived quietly and died quietly, souls who had not shaped history but still deserved rest. There were depths for the monstrous, the violent, the unrepentant, those whose lives were wars against the living. There were places reserved for heroes and kings, not as rewards for vanity, but because even in death, the universe preserves a record of impact. And at the center of it all, he raised a court. Not a court of music and feasting, a court of judgment. The world often forgets this and calls Hades the god of death, as if he hunted lives and carried them away. That was never his true role. The taking of life belonged to other hands, to fate, to chance, to war, to illness, to the quiet end of breath. Hades was not the executioner. He was the keeper. He was the one who ensured that death stayed where it belonged, that the dead did not spill upward like a flood, that the living were not swallowed by chaos. To do that, he needed allies, not friends in the warm sense, because warmth is rare in a kingdom made of endings. He needed agents who understood duty. He found them. Thanatos, death's personification, cold and direct, not cruel but absolute. Hypnos, sleep's gentle brother, whose touch resembled death enough that mortals feared him too. The Chares, spirits of violent death that haunted battlefields like scavengers. And the Erinyes, the Furies, ancient as guilt, who pursued oath-breakers and kinslayers with a devotion that never got tired. Hades did not create these beings, but he gave them direction. He gave them purpose inside a system. He turned the underworld from a concept into an institution. Then there were the gates. A kingdom is defined by its boundaries. The underworld's boundary had to be more than stone. It had to be fate. So Hades established the rivers that separate worlds. The Styx, the river of oaths, where even gods were forced to treat promises as law. The Acheron, the river of pain, carrying grief like a current. The Cocytus, the river of lamentation, where tears never dried. The Phlegethon, fire flowing like blood. The Lethe, forgetfulness, the mercy that allows even sorrow to loosen its grip. These rivers were not decorations. They were mechanisms. The underworld was not only a place to arrive. It was a process, a transformation, a stripping away of what the living cling to. And because processes can be cheated, because mortals and gods alike will always search for shortcuts, Hades assigned a guardian. Cerberus, three-headed, vigilant, monstrous, not evil, simply unyielding. Cerberus was not there to torture the dead. Cerberus was there to prevent a second tragedy, to ensure that the living did not invade death, and that the dead did not escape it. The dead accepted these laws with the resignation of those who no longer have choices. But the living hated them. They did not hate Hades for cruelty. They hated him because his realm made their fantasies end. Mortals love gods who promise victory. Mortals love gods who promise fertility and harvest. Mortals love gods who promise storms that defeat enemies. But mortals do not love the god who says, "You will end, and the ending will be orderly." So HADES became a name spoken softly, a name whispered into rituals, never shouted in celebration, a name avoided in casual speech. People pointed at Zeus when they wanted hope. They pointed at Poseidon when they wanted fear that could be bargained with. They did not point at Hades. They avoided looking downward. And that, more than any chain in Tartarus, became Hades' isolation. It was not only mortals who treated him this way. Even among gods, there was a distance that formed naturally, as if the underworld's air clung to him wherever he walked. At gatherings on Olympus, if he attended, laughter would lower in volume. Conversations would shift. Cupbearers would move a little faster. Not because Hades threatened them, but because his presence reminded them of the one truth even immortals dread, that nothing lasts unchanged. He did not blame them. Blame is an emotion for those who still expect affection. Hades expected duty. But duty has a cost, and the cost began to show in the way he ruled. The underworld's justice was strict. It had to be. The laws of death cannot be casual. If exceptions become common, the world collapses into bargaining. If bargaining becomes normal, then the living never accept limits. They begin to believe everything can be purchased, even the return of breath. Hades refused that future. So he became, in stories, harsh. When Orpheus descended later, desperate to retrieve Eurydice, it was Hades who listened, and it was Hades who set the condition. Do not look back. A simple rule. A merciful rule compared to the impossible. But still a rule. Orpheus failed. The underworld did not bend, and mortals wept and blamed Hades as if the condition itself was cruelty. But Hades did not create the weakness in Orpheus' heart. Hades only revealed it. When heroes came to bargain, he granted little. Not because he enjoyed refusal, but because he understood a truth mortals rarely accept. Every exception becomes a precedent. Every precedent becomes an epidemic of entitlement. So he guarded the boundaries like a physician guarding a wound from infection. This is where many call him a tyrant. They do not understand the difference between tyranny and necessity. Tyranny is power exercised for hunger. Necessity is power exercised so the world does not shatter. Hades lived inside necessity. But necessity makes you hard if you do not remember why you chose it. And over time, Hades' hardness began to look, even to himself, like a kind of armor he could no longer remove. There were days when he walked his halls and heard only footsteps that belonged to no breathing body. Days when he listened to the murmurs of the dead and felt nothing but administration. Days when his throne felt less like a seat of authority and more like a stone that kept him from floating upward into a life he could never again touch. In those moments, something dangerous grew inside him. Not rage, not jealousy, a hunger for meaning, for a personal story that was not built entirely from other people's endings. Because Hades' realm was full of lives, but none of them were his. His kingdom was crowded, and yet he was alone. And it is in loneliness, not in violence, that the next chapter of his legend took root. The story that would define his name more than his war, more than his laws, more than his empire of shadows. The story of desire, the story of a goddess of spring, and a king of the dead who dared to reach upward. Chapter 4. The Bride of Spring, the King of Winter. There are two ways the old stories speak about Persephone. In one telling, she is a girl gathering flowers, innocent as the morning, and the earth opens beneath her like a betrayal. She is seized. She screams. The sunlight vanishes. Her mother hears the echo and the world begins to starve. In another telling, she is not only a girl. She is a goddess with her own gravity. She has watched the world of Olympus and felt its limitations. She has sensed the way Zeus ruled. She has sensed the way Hera endures. She has sensed the way Demeter protects. And somewhere in her, there is a hunger for a realm that does not smile while it lies. In that telling, Persephone does not only fall, she descends. The myths disagree because mortals disagree about the nature of power. They disagree about whether a woman can choose darkness without being called stolen. They disagree about whether a king can love without first committing a crime. They disagree because the underworld makes humans uncomfortable, and discomfort always rewrites the truth into something easier to swallow. But here's what remains constant in every version. Hades wanted her. And wanting, for a god who has ruled loneliness for ages, can become a form of violence. Hades had watched the living world from below, not with longing for sunlight, but with awareness that life was always moving above him, and his realm was always waiting. He saw weddings and feasts and harvests, all the bright rituals that mortals clung to like proof that existence was gentle. He heard prayers spoken to Zeus for victory, to Poseidon for safe travel, to Demeter for grain, to Apollo for healing. He heard very few prayers to him, not because he was weak, but because fear makes worship quiet. Hades accepted that, until he noticed Persephone. She moved through the world like a blessing. Not the fragile kind that breaks when touched, but the kind that changes everything it touches. Spring did not belong to her alone, but she carried its promise. She carried the sensation of beginnings, the softness that makes the hardest heart briefly believe in mercy. For a king who sat among endings, Persephone was a contradiction. She was not death. She was renewal. And that was exactly why she terrified him. Because if death is absolute, then love is the one thing that can make even an absolute god feel unsure of himself. Hades did not simply desire Persephone's beauty. He desired what she represented. A bridge. A reconciliation between the world above and the world below. A way to be more than a function of the cosmos. A way to be personal. But Hades had never learned courtship in life. He did not grow up with festivals and laughter. He grew up inside a tyrant's stomach. He learned survival, not softness. He learned structures and boundaries. He learned to take the world seriously because the world had tried to erase him. So when Hades wanted Persephone, he did not approach her like a poet. He approached her like a king. And kings, when they are lonely, often mistake authority for permission. In many traditions, it is Zeus who gives the permission. This is a detail people often ignore because it complicates the moral simplicity they crave. In several tellings, Hades does not act alone. He asks Zeus for Persephone. Zeus, the ruler of the sky, agrees, either openly or through silence. Some stories say Zeus gives consent in secret, because he knows Demeter will never allow it. Some say he values alliance with Hades and considers Persephone's marriage a political necessity. If that is true, and it often is in the old record of myth, then the abduction is not only Hades' crime, it is Olympus's. It is the betrayal of a daughter by the structures of power above her. But even if Zeus agreed, Hades still chose the method, and the method was force. The earth opened in a meadow. The ground split like a mouth. A chariot rose from the deep, pulled by immortal horses whose hooves sounded like verdicts. Hades seized Persephone, and the world learned a new kind of scream, the sound of spring being dragged into winter. The underworld swallowed her, and Demeter, her mother, felt the theft like a blade in her spine. Demeter was not a gentle goddess when provoked. She was the law of agriculture, the reason cities could exist. She controlled grain, and grain controls everything. A city without grain becomes a grave. A kingdom without harvest becomes a riot. An empire without food becomes a rumor. Demeter searched. She wandered the earth with torches, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, refusing to accept that the world could take her child and continue as if it was normal. She asked gods and mortals. She questioned rivers and forests. She threatened those who lied. She punished those who withheld information. And as she searched, the fields began to die. It did not happen like a dramatic curse. It happened like grief made physical. Seeds refused to sprout. Leaves curled. Fruit rotted before ripening. Rain came at the wrong time, or not at all. The earth became thin and bitter. Mortals starved. Mothers held children whose ribs began to show. Kings offered sacrifices that smelled like desperation. And Olympus, for all its majesty, began to feel the pressure. Because gods are sustained by worship, and worship collapses when people collapse. This is where the myth reveals its most brutal truth. The suffering of mortals matters to the gods when it threatens the gods. Demeter's grief became a crisis of governance. Zeus, who could command storms, could not command a mother's heart. He attempted negotiation. He sent messengers. He tried persuasion. He tried the authority of a king who believed his rule was the axis of the cosmos. Demeter refused. She did not argue in poetry. She argued in famine. Bring my daughter back, or the world will end. And at last, Zeus turned his attention downward, to Hades. Imagine Hades in those days. Persephone in his realm, the underworld changed by the presence of spring. The dead who were accustomed to endless dusk, now feeling something like softness in the air. A queen moving through halls that were built for silence, carrying light in her skin as if it could not be extinguished. Was Persephone weeping? In some tellings, yes, bitter and furious. Was she silent, observing, learning the underworld's truths? In some tellings, also, yes. Was she already becoming something more than the daughter of Demeter? Something older and sharper and darker. The myths allow it, but no myth denies that Hades wanted her to stay. And Hades, for all his rigidity, did not treat her as a disposable trophy. This detail matters too. If Hades was purely a monster, Persephone would have been reduced to a prisoner and forgotten. But the stories insist she became queen of the underworld, not a servant, not a concubine hidden in shame, a queen. That does not erase the violence of her arrival, but it complicates the idea that Hades' heart was empty. He built her a throne beside his own. He offered her power, and power is a language gods take seriously. Yet the underworld has its own kind of coercion, a quiet coercion that feels like inevitability. Persephone was far from her mother, far from the living world, surrounded by the dead, the air itself heavy with endings. To accept Hades' court was, in some sense, to survive. And Hades, who understood survival better than any Olympian, understood that a queen who does not consent will eventually become an enemy. So he tried in his way to make her more than a captive. He showed her the laws, the boundaries, the purpose of the underworld. He showed her that without this realm, the world above would be haunted by chaos. He showed her that he did not take pleasure in death, but he did take responsibility for it. He offered her respect. But respect offered after theft is not pure. It is a shadow that follows every gesture. Then came the moment that became the heart of the myth, the pomegranate. Zeus demanded Persephone's return because Demeter's famine was breaking the world. Hades faced a choice: release her fully and return to his solitary reign, or bind her to his realm forever and risk a war with Olympus itself. He chose a third path. He fed her the seeds of the underworld. Some say he tricked her. Some say he offered them and she ate knowingly. Some say she ate because hunger is a simple thing, even for a goddess, after days of refusing food. The outcome is what matters. In the ancient lore of myth, to eat the food of a realm is to belong to it. It is a bond, a contract written into the soul. Persephone, by tasting the pomegranate, became part of the underworld, and Hades gained something he could claim without constant force: a legal tie. Here is where many call him cruel, and they are not wrong, because the pomegranate is the underworld's most elegant trap. It does not look like a chain. It looks like fruit. It looks like sweetness. It looks like choice. But it is binding. Hades, who built the prison for titans, built a smaller prison for love. Not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of returning to silence. Fear that the only beautiful thing that ever entered his realm would leave, and never look back. Zeus sent Hermes as messenger to retrieve Persephone. Hermes descended, bright and quick, a creature made for movement. He found Persephone and spoke the command of Olympus. And Hades did not fight Hermes with weapons. He fought with law. "She has eaten here," Hades said. And the universe, which respects ancient rules more than it respects tears, listen. So a compromise was carved into reality. Persephone would spend part of the year above with Demeter, and part of the year below with Hades. The number of months varies by telling, because different lands shape the myth to match their seasons. But the pattern remained. When Persephone rises, Demeter's joy returns, and the world blooms. When Persephone descends, Demeter grieves, and the world withers. This is the myth mortals tell to explain winter, but beneath it is a harsher explanation. The world's seasons are the shadow of a family's trauma, a mother's grief, a daughter's divided life, a king's loneliness. Hades achieved something immense. He gained a queen. He forged a bond between realms. He ensured that the underworld was no longer entirely separate from the living world. A bridge was created, and bridges change everything. And yet, the way he achieved it stained his name forever. The underworld's king became a figure of romantic dread, the dark lover, the abductor. the husband who took what he wanted and then demanded the world accept it as fate. This is where people either villainize him completely or sanitize him completely. Both are mistakes. Hades did wrong. And Hades also did something that many gods never do. He kept the bargain. He returned Persephone when the time came. He did not chase her with storms. He did not shatter the sky in protest. He did not demand Zeus alter the terms. He obeyed the compromise because even he understood that love that becomes a cage will eventually become hatred. And Persephone, over time, changed. This is the part the softer stories hesitate to say. The underworld does not only consume, it also teaches. Persephone learned judgment. She learned the faces of the dead. She learned which souls were broken by circumstance and which were broken by choice. She learned the weight of decisions that cannot be undone. She learned to stand beside Hades and feel the burden of absolute law. In some traditions, she becomes not merely a captive, but a ruler who commands fear herself. She is called Dread Queen. She is the one who can soothe spirits and also punish them. She's the one whose presence makes the underworld feel less like a pit and more like a kingdom. And Hades, in that transformation, found something he had never possessed before. A partner. Not always a gentle partner, not always a happy one, but a partner who could understand his realm without flinching. Still, no myth leaves Hades without shadows and love. Before Persephone, there were nymphs and spirits who entered his attention like brief flames in a cold hall. Mint, a nymph associated with the underworld's rivers, was one of them. In some stories, she boasted that she would replace Persephone. In others, she was simply a lover discarded when a queen arrived. The outcome is always cruel. Mint is transformed into mint, crushed underfoot. Her fragrance a reminder that love in the orbit of gods often ends as punishment. Luz, another nymph, is said to have been loved by Hades and taken to the underworld, then transformed into a white poplar after her death, a tree sacred to him. Even here, love becomes a monument, not a life. A beautiful thing preserved, yes, but also fixed, unable to grow beyond the shape the god chooses for it. These stories are not there to make Hades look romantic. They are there to show a pattern. Hades is consistent. When he wants something, he makes it permanent. That permanence can look like devotion. It can also look like domination. So when Persephone's cycle began, and the world above learned to live with seasons as a compromise of divine conflict, Hades returned to his throne with a new weight beside him. A queen who would leave and return. A love that was never simple. A bond that carried both tenderness and coercion. And now the underworld had something it never had before. Not just law, not just boundaries, not just silence. It had a story, but stories invite visitors, and visitors invite problems. Because once mortals learned that a goddess could descend and return, heroes began to believe they could do the same. They began to believe they could break the rules of death if they were brave enough, clever enough, or loved enough. Hades would soon discover that the greatest threat to his kingdom would not be titans. It would be the living. Chapter 5. The living who broke the door, and the king who refused to bend. Once Persephone began her cycle, the world above changed its rhythm. Mortals learned to measure time by absence and return. They learned to call loss a season instead of a catastrophe. They learned to say, "Winter will pass," as if that phrase could make grief less sharp. But the deeper change was quieter. A door had been proven. If a goddess could descend and rise again, then death no longer felt like an iron wall. It began to feel like a gate with rules. And whenever mortals sense rules, they begin to believe they can negotiate them. This is how heroes are born. not from strength alone, but from the arrogance that rules were made for others. Hades watched this shift with a cold understanding that Zeus did not fully share. Zeus ruled a realm of movement. Storms can change direction. Thunder can strike twice. The sky forgives itself by resetting each morning. Poseidon ruled a realm of chaos where nothing holds shape for long. The sea is always changing, always swallowing and returning. Hades ruled the only place that could not afford improvisation. The underworld is stability at its most severe. If the dead can come and go whenever a brave man feels passionate, then the living world becomes a haunted accident. If rules can be broken, then rules are not rules. They are suggestions. And Hades did not build a kingdom of suggestions. So when the first great intrusions began, he responded with what he knew best. Law. Law. The earliest visitors did not come with armies. They came with grief. Orpheus was among the most famous. He was not a warrior. He was a singer. His music was said to make stone lean forward as if it wanted to hear. He was said to tame wild beasts, to soften hearts hardened by war, to make even gods pause and remember the gentler parts of themselves. When Eurydice died, Orpheus did not accept it. He did what mortals always do when love becomes pain. He decided the universe was wrong. He descended. The road to the underworld is described in many ways. A cave, a crack in the earth, a riverbank where the air tastes like iron. But every version agrees on the feeling. The world grows quieter the farther down you go. The colors fade. The air becomes heavy, as if the very concept of breath is being questioned. Orpheus arrived at the gates, and the guardians did what guardians do. They resisted. Charon demanded payment. Cerberus bared his teeth. The rivers hummed with ancient warning. The dead stared with the hunger of those who miss sunlight. Orpheus did not swing a sword. He played, and the underworld listened. This is one of Hades' greatest victories that no one calls a victory. The underworld did not shatter when Orpheus entered. It did not collapse into chaos. It did not become a playground for grief. It tested him. It forced him to follow the proper path. It demanded he approach the throne and ask. Orpheus stood before Hades and Persephone, and he did what mortals do best when they are desperate. He turned pain into art. He spoke of love, of loss, of the cruelty of sudden endings. He made the underworld itself feel the echo of life. Persephone, who knew what it was to be divided between realms, felt it sharply. Her gaze was not soft, but it was attentive. The underworld had made her wise in the language of sorrow. Hades listened too. This matters. If Hades was only a monster, he would have laughed. He would have punished Orpheus for daring to ask. He would have made an example out of him. Instead, Hades considered. Consideration from a god like Hades is rare. It is heavy. It means the law is being measured against compassion, not replaced by it, but tested. Hades agreed to a bargain. Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the living world. But Orpheus must not look back until they both reached the surface. The condition was simple. The condition was fair. The condition was merciful compared to the impossible. The condition also served the underworld's purpose. If Orpheus could not trust, then he did not deserve the exception. If he could not obey one rule, then he could not be trusted with the boundary between life and death. Orpheus climbed. Eurydice followed. Silence pressed against them like a hand. And at the last moment, near the mouth of the world, Orpheus looked back. He looked back because mortals do not only fear loss. They fear uncertainty. They fear that hope is a trick. They fear that the thing they want most will vanish unless they confirm it with their eyes. Orpheus looked back. Eurydice was pulled away. And Orpheus screamed as if the world had betrayed him, even though the betrayal came from his own doubt. Mortals blamed Hades. They always did. They said Hades was cruel for setting the condition. They said he was cruel for not forgiving the mistake. They said he was cruel because he did not allow love to conquer death. But Hades did not build the underworld so that love could conquer death. He built it so that death could remain what it is. If Orpheus had succeeded, a precedent would have been set. Every poet would have tried. Every grieving spouse would have demanded the same mercy. Every king would have purchased songs to drag soldiers back from battlefields. Every warlord would have turned the underworld into a warehouse of lives he could retrieve at will. Hades refused that future. So he remained the villain in a love story that was never truly about him. That was the first of many injustices laid at his feet. The next intruder came not with music, but with muscle. Heracles. Heracles did not descend out of love. He descended as a task. One of his labors required him to bring Cerberus up from the underworld and show him to the living world. Think about the insult. Cerberus was not a trophy. Cerberus was the lock on the universe's most important door. To drag him upward was to make a mockery of the boundary Hades maintained. Heracles entered, and unlike many mortals, he did not come as a thief who hoped to remain unseen. He came as a conqueror, confident that strength could solve anything. This is where people often misunderstand Hades again. They assume Hades must have been furious, that he must have attacked, that he must have unleashed the dead like an army. But Hades knew something Heracles did not. Violence in the underworld is always risky. The underworld is full of energy that wants to rise, full of souls that want a second chance. If you start a war there, you may open fractures that cannot be closed. So Hades did not explode. He negotiated. In many tellings, Heracles asked permission, or at least announced his intention. Hades did not grant it out of kindness. He granted it with conditions. Heracles could take Cerberus only if he did it without weapons, without harming the beast, without turning the guardian into a victim. Heracles wrestled Cerberus, wrestled him with bare hands, and dragged him upward, and the living world saw the monster and shuddered in awe. Then Cerberus was returned. That return is important. Heracles did not keep him. Heracles did not kill him. The underworld's lock remained intact. This is another strange mercy Hades is rarely credited for. He could have refused and fought. He could have made the labor impossible. He could have turned Heracles into another shade. Instead, he allowed the boundary to be tested in a controlled way, and then restored. A controlled exception, not a collapse. But controlled exceptions attract reckless imitators. And then came the attempt that revealed Hades' harshness, without any softness to balance it. Theseus and Pirithous. Two heroes, friends bound by arrogance more than wisdom. They decided they deserved divine brides. Theseus sought Helen, the most desired mortal girl, and succeeded in taking her, setting a chain reaction of war in motion. Pirithous decided to reach higher. He decided to take Persephone, not ask. Take Ointirau. This was not love. This was conquest dressed as romance. This was the living world trying to prove that no realm was sacred. They descended into the underworld like thieves entering a treasury. They arrived before Hades and Persephone, and they spoke their intention, as if boldness itself was a substitute for permission. This is where Hades' cruelty becomes visible, and also where his cruelty makes perfect sense. He did not strike them down in a rage. He invited them to sit. In the underworld there is a chair known in myth as the chair of forgetfulness, or the chair of binding, a seat that becomes a trap. Hades offered it with calm politeness, the kind of politeness that makes an insult sharper. They sat, and they could not rise. Their bodies held, their minds dulled. Time pressed against them. They became living prisoners in the realm they tried to invade. It was punishment, yes. It was also a message. The underworld is not a place you rob, The dead are not a resource. The queen is not a prize. The king is not a fool. Theseus remained trapped for a long time. In some stories, Heracles later freed him as part of his own descent. Pirithous, who dared to name Persephone as a target, was not freed. Not in the old record. His punishment is lasting. People call this torture. It is. But it is also enforcement. If Hades let such a crime pass, the underworld would become a marketplace for violent men who thought confidence was destiny. Hades chose to be feared rather than invaded. This is the constant contradiction of his rule. Every act that preserves the boundary makes him look merciless. Every mercy risks collapsing the boundary. So he chooses mercilessness more often than most gods would. That is one of his successes. It is also one of his sins. Other conflicts rose from different kinds of cheating. Sisyphus was a king who tried to trick death itself. He betrayed guests, murdered travelers, turned hospitality into a weapon, then attempted to escape consequence by binding death's agent, halting the natural order. In some tellings he chained Thanatos, and mortals stopped dying. Wars became absurd. Battles became endless because no one could finish falling. The world began to break. A world without death is not a paradise. It is a clogged throat. Ares, disgusted or amused depending on the version, freed Thanatos. Death resumed its function. Sisyphus was dragged down. But Sisyphus had another trick. He convinced his wife not to bury him properly, then complained in the underworld that he had been wronged. He argued he deserved to return and punish her disrespect. Some say Persephone allowed him to go back to correct the injustice. Some say Hades permitted it as a temporary exception. Sisyphus returned to life and refused to come back. He lived as long as he could, feeding on stolen time. When he finally died again, the underworld did what it always does. It corrected the imbalance. Sisyphus was condemned to push a boulder uphill forever, only for it to roll down each time, an endless labor that mirrored his endless deceit. Mortals call this cruelty. Hades calls it fit. A man who tried to make death meaningless is given a punishment where effort becomes meaningless. Not because Hades enjoys suffering, but because Hades believes consequence is the spine of reality. Then there was another threat, one that did not come from a single hero but from a healer's hands. Asclepius, a mortal physician so skilled that he began to bring people back from the dead. The living cheered. Families rejoiced. Mortals praised him as if he was undoing injustice. Hades saw something else. If resurrection becomes common, the underworld becomes irrelevant. The boundary becomes optional. The world becomes unstable. The dead do not remain dead. The living do not accept loss. Grief does not mature into wisdom. It becomes entitlement. Hades complained to Zeus in many tellings, because this kind of cheating threatened the entire structure of the cosmos. And Zeus, guarding his own authority, struck Asclepius down with lightning. Mortals then blamed Zeus and Hades both. They always blame the gods who uphold limits. They never blame the arrogance that tries to erase limits. But Hades paid a different price. Every time the underworld held, it looked like cruelty. Every time it refused exceptions, it looked like spite. Every time it punished, it looked like enjoyment. Hades was becoming the villain in every human story where someone did not get what they wanted. And that villain role hardened him further. He began to treat the living not as fragile beings worthy of empathy, but as constant threats to the order he maintained. He saw them as children who never stop reaching for knives. He saw them as a species that will always demand more, always complain, always forget the consequences that keep their world intact. This is where some of his bullying enters the myths. Hades does not bully by shouting. He bullies by indifference. A soul begs for one more message to a loved one above, and the answer is no. A hero boasts, and Hades punishes without raising his voice. A mortal prays not for mercy but for advantage, and Hades ignores him completely. Hades does not play the warm god. He lets the underworld teach through harshness. And yet, even as he was feared, even as his name became a whisper, Hades had moments that reveal another side. When the dead arrived confused, he did not torment them for amusement. He placed them. He gave them a place, even if the place was dim. He maintained a world where souls did not simply dissolve into nothingness. For countless mortals, the underworld was not a torture chamber. It was a destination, a final order, a cessation of suffering. That is a strange mercy, too. But mercies that are quiet rarely earn songs. What earned songs were the exceptions, the bargains, the punishments, the abductions, the traps. So Hades became a god people feared more than they understood. And then something even more dangerous happened. The gods began to treat his realm as a tool. Zeus began to send messages downward not as requests, but as commands, as if the underworld was merely a prison facility that belonged to Olympus, rather than a kingdom with its own sovereign law. Poseidon treated the underworld as distant, almost irrelevant, because it did not splash or roar. Even Persephone, who ruled beside him, was divided by her cycle, always leaving, always returning, always belonging to two worlds. Hades began to feel the old pressure again, not Kronos' stomach, but Olympus's assumption. That Hades would do the difficult work and accept the loneliness as payment. The king of the dead began to feel used. And when a ruler feels used, he either breaks or he becomes colder. Hades chose colder. But coldness invites rebellion, and rebellion invites war. The next chapter would not be about heroes stealing into the underworld. It would be about the underworld pushing back, about Hades' darkest authority rising like a tide that even Olympus could not ignore. Chapter 6. The god the world misnamed, and the authority beneath authority. There is a lie mortals repeat because it makes fear easier to understand. They call Hades the god of death. It sounds correct. It feels correct. When someone dies, people whisper his name or avoid it, as if silence can keep the underworld from listening. But the oldest structure of the myths is clearer than common speech. Death itself is not Hades. Death is Thanatos, or fate, or the quiet cut that ends breath. Hades does not strike the final blow. Hades receives what remains. Hades is not the end. Hades is the rule that follows the end. He is the keeper of what everyone else would rather forget. And because mortals misunderstand him, they blame him. They blame him for illness. They blame him for war. They blame him for accidents and storms and the slow decay of old age. They blame him because blaming someone gives grief a target. Grief without a target becomes unbearable. So Hades becomes the target. This is the injustice that shapes him most. Not the prison inside Kronos, not even the underworld's loneliness, but the endless, repetitive human demand for a villain. Imagine the prayers that reach him. They are not like the prayers to Zeus, full of hope and bargains. They are not like the prayers to Demeter, full of gratitude. They are not like the prayers to Poseidon, full of fear that still believes in negotiation. The prayers to Hades are private. They are whispered into soil. They are spoken into the mouth of a grave. They are often not requests. They are accusations. Why did you take him? Why did you take her? Why did you take my child? Why did you choose my house? Hades hears these words and cannot answer without undermining the law he embodies. If he answers, he admits that death is personal and selective, that the underworld's kin chooses victims like a hunter chooses prey. But that is not the truth. The truth is that death is vast and indifferent, and Hades is the one who prevents that indifference from becoming chaos. He cannot comfort them with honesty because honesty would not comfort them. So he stays silent. And silence to the grieving looks like cruelty. This is why his reputation darkens with every generation. And this is why mortals invented another lie, one that reveals their fear in a different way. They merged him with Pluton, the wealthy one, because beneath the earth there is not only the dead, there is also treasure, gold veins, gemstones did war, fertile soil, the deep resources that make kingdoms possible. Mortals looked downward and saw both death and wealth, and they decided the ruler of one must rule the other. This gave Hades another mask, not only the king of the dead, but the king of hidden riches, and that made him more complicated and more dangerous, because now his realm was not only something people feared, it was something people wanted. They began to make offerings not only to avoid death, but to gain fortune. They began to pray to the underworld for gold, for success, for the kind of power that comes from what is buried. Hades watched mortals do this and felt a bitter recognition. They did not want to understand him. They wanted to use him. This mirrored what Olympus had begun to do. So Hades' authority hardened into something colder than law. It became pride, not the loud pride of Zeus, who loves recognition, not the restless pride of Poseidon, who loves to prove himself. Hades' pride is the pride of the one who holds the foundation and is never thanked for it, the pride of the one who watches everyone else dance on the roof he supports. This pride did not make him evil, but it made him dangerous. Because when a foundation decides it is tired of supporting, everything above it shakes. There are myths that hint at this, myths where the underworld threatens to overflow, where ghosts rise, where the boundary trembles. Most are not stories of Hades attacking. They are stories of balance being disturbed and Hades refusing to clean up other people's messes without consequence. One of the most telling conflicts, and one of the least celebrated, is not a war of armies. It is a war of jurisdiction. When gods and mortals attempted to bend the underworld's rules, Hades did not always answer with punishment. Sometimes he answered by reminding the cosmos that his realm has sovereignty. This is where he clashes with Zeus in ways that rarely become popular songs. Zeus is the king of gods, yes, but his kingship is not absolute in every domain. The division of the cosmos was not decorative. It was a distribution of reality. The sky belongs to Zeus. The sea belongs to Poseidon. The underworld belongs to Hades. When Zeus sends Hermes downward with a command, it is tolerated because Hermes is a messenger and because the cosmos needs cooperation. But there is a thin line between cooperation and ownership. Hades felt that line being crossed again and again. Olympus would send heroes to retrieve souls. Olympus would send threats and orders. Olympus would treat the underworld as a storage room rather than a kingdom. Hades' answer was never loud. It was final. The dead remain. The boundary holds. Even Zeus cannot simply pull a soul from his realm without the underworld's law accepting it. This refusal creates tension that mortals rarely notice, because mortals see Zeus's lightning and assume it is the ultimate authority. But beneath that lightning is the underworld's permanence. Zeus can strike a man dead. Hades can refuse to let that man return. That is a different kind of power, and it is the kind that breeds resentment. Resentment from Olympus. Resentment from mortals. Resentment from heroes who want their stories to end with miracles. Hades becomes the antagonist not because he attacks, but because he says no. In myth, no is the most hated word. Now, if that was all, the underworld would remain a quiet, grim machine. But Hades had Persephone, and Persephone changed everything. Because Persephone, unlike Hades, still belonged partly to the living world. She still felt Demeter's grief. She still understood sunlight. She still remembered laughter. She could read mortals not only as threats, but as fragile creatures who forget because their lives are short. So Persephone often softened the edges of Hades' rule, not by breaking the law, but by interpreting it. This made her powerful, and it made her dangerous to those who crave simple stories. In some versions of myth, Persephone becomes the one who convinces Hades to listen to Orpheus. In others, she becomes the one who grants small mercies to shades, easing their suffering, guiding them to quieter places. She becomes an active queen, not a passive trophy. Hades, watching her, learned a lesson he did not learn in war. Power does not have to be loud to be absolute. Persephone ruled with a softness that could become steel. Hades ruled with steel that could rarely become softness. Together, they became a balanced threat. And balance, to those who wish to manipulate, is frustrating. Now the underworld was not only guarded by Lord Darrow. It was guarded by a queen who understood persuasion and a king who understood permanence. But balance comes at a cost. Persephone's divided cycle meant that each year, Hades returned to solitude for months. Each year, the underworld felt colder without her. Each year, Hades faced the old fear again. The fear of abandonment, the fear of silence, the fear that his kingdom would forever be a place no one chooses willingly. That fear is what makes him appear controlling. It is what makes his love look like captivity, even when it contains respect. It is what makes him keep the pomegranate's contract sacred, because the contract is the only guarantee he has that spring will return. And yet, contracts do not create affection. They only create obligation. So Hades' life becomes a cycle too. Persephone descends. The underworld warms with her presence. Hades feels almost human in his relief. He permits himself small moments of tenderness, the kind that feels embarrassing to a god whose reputation is fear. Persephone rises. The underworld empties of color again. Hades' court returns to pure function. He becomes colder, harsher, more rigid. This cycle shapes him. It makes him inconsistent in the eyes of those who judge him. Sometimes he is the stern judge who cannot be moved. Sometimes he is the quiet husband who waits. Sometimes he is the abductor whose crime cannot be forgiven. Sometimes he is the necessary ruler who prevents chaos. Mortals hate inconsistency because it makes it harder to label someone as a villain. But gods are not moral symbols. They are forces with emotions. And Hades, more than most, is a force that feels. He feels the weight of countless souls arriving every day. He feels their regrets like a constant wind in his halls. He feels their fear. He feels their denial. He feels their anger. He feels their pleading. Imagine sitting on a throne while an endless line of the dead approaches, and every one of them believes their story is special enough to deserve exception. Imagine hearing for ages the same human sentence spoken in 1,000 languages. This is not fair. Hades cannot correct them without rewriting the universe. So he says, in 1,000 ways, the only sentence he can truly say, "This is what is." And that sentence, delivered over centuries, carved him into something that looks, from above, like cold cruelty. This is where the myths begin to paint him as a bully, not because he enjoys humiliating the weak, but because he does not bend to them. In the mortal mind, refusal is oppression. In Hades' mind, refusal is duty. But duty without compassion becomes tyranny. Hades walked that edge. Sometimes he stayed on the side of necessity. Sometimes he slipped into harshness because harshness is easier than sympathy. And then came the moment when the underworld faced a threat that was not a hero, not a poet, not a grieving spouse. A threat that was cosmic. A threat that could unmake law itself. A monster that did not fear punishment because it was older than fear. A force that consumed not only bodies, but order. When that threat rose, even Zeus looked downward with a rare kind of seriousness. Because the sky can survive a storm, but it cannot survive a fracture in the underworld. Chapter 7. The Wars Under the World, and the King Who Held the Floor of Reality. There are monsters that terrify mortals because they kill. And there are monsters that terrify gods because they undo. The underworld, for all of its darkness, is not chaos. It is organized darkness. It is an ordered destination, a system that keeps the universe from becoming a haunted accident. So the greatest threats to Hades are not those who arrive dead. The greatest threats are those who threaten the structure of death itself. One of the oldest and most dangerous of these is Typhon, a storm made into a being, a chaos that learned how to breathe. Typhon is described with 100 voices, 100 heads, a living embodiment of the world's wildness before law took hold. When Typhon rises, even the gods understand that their thrones are not guaranteed. In many tellings, Typhon challenges Zeus directly, and the battle is so violent that the world forgets peace. Some myths say Zeus is wounded. Some say he is temporarily defeated. The details shift like smoke, but the terror remains consistent. The order of Olympus was not as stable as it pretended to be. During such cosmic disturbances, the underworld becomes more than a kingdom. It becomes a seal, a pressure valve, a vault holding things that must not return to the surface. Hades' role in these moments is rarely celebrated because it is not dramatic in a visible way. But think like the universe for a moment. If Olympus collapses in a war with a force like Typhon, what happens to the prison beneath the world? What happens to Tartarus? If the locks weaken, the Titans may rise. If the gates fracture, ancient enemies may return. If the boundary between life and death shakes, the dead may flood upward, not as ghosts with messages, but as a mass of restless souls with no place to go. Hades understood this better than Zeus. Zeus fought to defeat Typhon. Hades fought to keep the floor from cracking while Zeus fought. This is where the underworld's king shows his true greatness. Not in romance, not in cruelty, in responsibility. In the oldest sense, Hades is not only a god. He is a stabilizer, a pillar that holds up the world's weight. And pillars do not get applause. They get pressure. So Hades tightened his realm. The gates of Tartarus were reinforced. The wardens were commanded to vigilance. The Furies were sent to hunt any cracks in law, any souls that found strange paths upward during the cosmic chaos. Cerberus became more than a guardian. He became a living warning. Do not test the door now. And in those days, the dead came in greater waves. War above creates harvest below. The underworld swelled with new arrivals, souls thrown downward by battle, disaster, panic, and the unpredictable ripples of a world at war with itself. Hades did not collapse under the volume. He processed it. That word sounds cold, administrative, almost insulting. But to process grief at scale is a kind of godhood few can handle without breaking. Hades handled it. This is why his realm remained intact while the sky shook. Now, if Typhon represents cosmic chaos, there is another force that threatens the underworld in a more intimate way. The hunger that eats gods from inside. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades are brothers, but brotherhood among gods is not a warm human thing. It is an alliance built on blood, history, resentment, and the constant temptation to compare. Zeus sits in the sky where everyone can see him. Poseidon commands oceans that touch every shore. Hades rules beneath, unseen, and it is easy in that invisibility to be forgotten. There are myths that hint at the underworld being treated like an afterthought in divine politics. Not because the underworld is weak, but because it is inconvenient. People want gods who give. Hades receives. People want gods who appear. Hades waits. This dynamic creates a slow burn of injustice. Hades did not ask for praise, but he demanded respect. And when respect is denied long enough, it becomes a wound. That wound shows in the way Hades treats those who challenge him. Not with theatrical cruelty, with finality. Consider the nature of his punishments. He does not often invent suffering for entertainment. He assigns consequences that reflect the crime. He makes the punishment teach the universe what the crime attempted to undo. Tantalus, who abused hospitality and mocked the gods, is placed in reach of water and fruit that always retreat, a lesson in eternal craving. Ixion, who violated sacred trust, is bound to an unending wheel, a lesson in endless motion without progress. The Danaids, who turned marriage into murder, are condemned to carry water in vessels that never fill, a lesson in labor that cannot wash away guilt. These punishments are not random. They are tailored. That tailoring is evidence of intelligence, and it is also evidence of a kind of cruelty that is more terrifying than rage. Rage burns hot, then fades. Hades' punishments endure. He is the god who makes a decision last. So when mortals say Hades is cruel, they are often reacting not to violence, but to permanence. Because permanence is the most frightening thing a mortal can imagine. Now, there is one more thread that reveals Hades' severity and his strange fairness at the same time. The curse of unburied dead. In ancient belief, burial rites mattered. Not as superstition, but as passage. A soul without proper rites could wander near the surface, restless, caught between worlds, unable to fully enter the underworld, and unable to return to life. This is not simply sad. It is unstable. A boundary full of trapped souls becomes thin. So Hades, though he was feared, was also the god who demanded that the living respect the dead with proper passage. To deny burial was to deny order. This is why in the story of Antigone, the refusal to bury becomes an act of arrogance against divine law. Mortals treat it as politics. Hades treats it as a fracture. The underworld requires ceremony because ceremony is how mortals acknowledge limits. And limits are how the cosmos stays sane. So Hades is both feared and, in that quiet way, depended on. Now, into this already tense world, Zeus makes one of his most consequential decisions. He allows and sometimes encourages the movement of gods and heroes into Hades' realm as if it were a tool. This happens repeatedly. Descents, trials, labors, bargains. Each one is a test of Hades' sovereignty. Each one is a reminder that Olympus, despite the division of realms, still considers itself the center. Hades tolerates this until tolerance becomes humiliation. And then he responds. Not by open war, by asserting the underworld's rights. This assertion is mythically subtle, but it is there. When the gods swear their most binding oaths, they swear by the Styx. The river is in Hades' domain. The river's authority is ancient, and even Zeus cannot break such an oath without consequences that shake his divine standing. This means something important. Hades' realm contains the mechanism that holds gods accountable. That is a terrifying power, because it limits Zeus. And Zeus, like all rulers, hates being limited, so there is always tension between them. Zeus is the king above. Hades is the law below. One wields spectacle. One wields inevitability. This tension does not explode into a clear war in the myths the way Zeus's war against Titans does. but it shows as cold distance, as avoidance, as the quiet recognition that if Hades ever truly opposed Zeus, the conflict would not be decided by thunder. It would be decided by the question of where a soul belongs. Because Zeus can kill, Hades can keep. Now, what about Poseidon? Poseidon is a brother who does not think much about death until it touches his shoreline. He is too busy being a storm, too busy being wounded by pride, too busy creating and destroying in the sea's restless rhythm. Poseidon has his own love stories, his own violence, his own arrogance. But Poseidon's realm is fluid, forgiving in its constant change. Hades' realm is not forgiving. So the brothers are different. And difference creates misunderstanding. Poseidon might see Hades as too cold, too rigid. Hades might see Poseidon as too impulsive, too careless. Zeus might see Hades as too independent, too uncharismatic, too difficult to manage. None of these perceptions are fully wrong, and that is why the family is never stable. The family is the cosmos' first political system, and like all political systems, it runs on compromise and resentment. And then a deeper darkness appears. A darkness not of the Underworld's law, but of something older. The dead begin to stir in strange ways. Not because they are being summoned, not because a hero has sung, not because the living have forgotten rites, because something is feeding on the boundary. In later mythic traditions and philosophical interpretations, this idea becomes clear. The Underworld is not only a place of punishment, it is a place of containment. It holds not just souls, but ancient threats. It holds the memory of titans. It holds the residue of cosmic violence. And when those residues are disturbed, the Underworld can become a battlefield. Hades, who fought titans and built cages, faces a familiar sensation, the sensation that the old world wants to return. It is in this moment that Hades shows the part of himself that many stories ignore. Courage, not the courage of the hero who wants praise, the courage of the ruler who must do the ugly work without being thanked. He descends deeper into his own kingdom, into places even his court avoids. He confronts disturbances in Tartarus. He inspects the chains and the gates. He orders reinforcements. He reasserts boundaries. He becomes, again, the lock. But every lock can be picked if someone is patient enough. And Hades' greatest vulnerability has always been the same. Not war. Not monsters. Not heroes. Love. Because love makes even a lawmaker hesitate. And when Hades hesitates, the universe notices. In the next chapter, that hesitation will be tested. Not by a hero. Not by Zeus. Not by a monster. By the one figure who knows Hades' realm and Hades' heart better than anyone. Persephone. Because Persephone is not only the queen who returns. She is also the one who can influence the Underworld's rules. And when she is pulled between her mother's grief and her husband's law, the Underworld's foundation trembles. Chapter 8. The Crown of Quiet. The weight of forever Persephone's return was always a miracle to the living world. When she rose, the earth remembered how to soften. Buds formed as if the world had been holding its breath. Rivers loosened. Fields became generous. Mortals looked at the first green and called it hope, as if hope was not simply a season on a schedule written by divine compromise. When Persephone descended, the world above turned hard again. Demeter's grief returned like a familiar wound opening. Leaves fell. The air sharpened. Nights lengthened. The living world mourned not only for dead relatives, but for the light itself. That cycle is the famous story. But what people rarely consider is what it did to Hades. Every year, he was forced to accept the same truth. Even his queen did not fully belong to him. He had achieved permanence through contract, through the pomegranate, through law. But permanence is not the same as devotion. It is not the same as desire. It is not the same as the warm certainty of being chosen freely. Hades had built his life on rules because rules are safer than love. But love kept stepping into his kingdom and reminding him that safety is not the same as peace. In the months when Persephone was with him, Hades seemed different. Not cheerful, because cheer is foreign to him, but less rigid, less metallic. His court felt less like a machine and more like a household. The dead were still judged. The gates were still guarded. The laws were still enforced. But there was an atmosphere that changed, a subtle easing, the sense that even in darkness, something could grow. Then Persephone would leave. The underworld would return to its pure function. Hades would sit on his throne and feel the old solitude again. Not the solitude of an empty room, because the underworld is never empty. He would feel the solitude of being surrounded by beings who need him but do not love him. Surrounded by shades who plead and resent. Surrounded by servants who obey out of fear or duty. Surrounded by mechanisms that continue because he commands them. A king can be surrounded and still be alone. In those months, Hades' harshness would intensify. His punishments would feel less flexible. His patience for heroes and visitors would shrink. His willingness to grant exceptions would vanish. Mortals would tell stories of his cruelty in winter, and they would not realize they were sensing his loneliness through the fabric of myth. This is where the underworld becomes personal, not just a realm, a mood. Now Persephone did not remain unchanged either. Each descent shaped her. She was not only spring. She became a ruler of shadows, a goddess who could look at death and not blink. That transformation gave her power that even Olympus had to respect, but it also gave her a dual loyalty that tore her in two. Demeter wanted her wholly. Hades wanted her permanently. Persephone belonged to both. That belonging created a tension that could never be solved without someone losing. And in myth, someone is always losing. Sometimes it was Demeter, forced to accept a divided daughter. Sometimes it was Persephone, forced to live two lives. Sometimes it was Hades, forced to accept the absence of the one presence that made his kingdom feel less like exile. He accepted it because he had to. The underworld is built on acceptance of what must be. Yet, there were moments when that acceptance looked like quiet violence, like the pomegranate itself, like the way he insisted that the contract remained sacred even when it hurt Demeter, even when it hurt Persephone, even when it made him appear monstrous. Here is the uncomfortable truth the myths keep whispering. Hades loved Persephone, and he also used her. He used her as a bridge to the living world. He used her as proof that the underworld could contain more than despair. He used her as a way to make his realm feel less like the place no one wants. This is what love can become when it is starved, not pure devotion, a hunger that mistakes possession for security. But Hades was not only a tyrant in love. He was also, in some stories, strangely respectful once the contract existed. He gave Persephone a throne. He permitted her authority. He did not hide her. He did not keep her as a secret shame. He acknowledged her as queen. And Persephone, in turn, became something that no one on Olympus could fully control. Not Zeus. Not Demeter. Not even Hades. In some traditions, Persephone rules over the dead with a hand as firm as Hades. She becomes the one who can grant release or enforce punishment. She becomes the one who hears pleas. She becomes the one who decides which ghosts are allowed to linger near the surface. If that is true, then Persephone is not merely a symbol. She is the underworld's second authority. And that changes the meaning of Hades' life. He is no longer only the keeper of endings. He is the king of a shared throne. But shared thrones require trust. And trust for Hades was always difficult, because trust is what Orpheus failed. Trust is what mortals ask for when they promise to obey, and then look back. Trust is what Zeus pretends to offer while making decisions in secret. Trust is what Poseidon breaks whenever his pride is wounded. Hades had learned from Kronos' stomach and from the Titan War and from endless human bargains that trust is a beautiful lie people tell until it becomes inconvenient. So how did a god like Hades survive centuries of ruling a kingdom built on loss? By becoming, himself, a kind of loss. He surrendered the possibility of being loved easily. He surrendered the possibility of being celebrated. He surrendered the possibility of being understood. He became the god that people need but do not want. This is the core tragedy of Hades. He is not banished in the dramatic way Titan kings were banished. He is not chained. He is not humiliated publicly. He is not defeated. He is simply assigned to the place everyone refuses to look. And he accepts it. That acceptance is his greatest strength. It is also what makes him appear cold. Because to accept such a role, you must harden yourself. Now consider his so-called successes. He helped overthrow the Titans and end the age of Kronos. That was a victory for the younger gods and for a world that needed a new order. He constructed the Underworld into a functional realm. He created laws that prevented chaos. He maintained boundaries that kept the living world stable. He kept Tartarus sealed. He ensured the old horrors did not return. He made even gods respect oaths through the Styx. He did these things without songs, without temples filled with laughter, without festivals that treated him like a friend. That is success. But the myths also preserve his moral failures. He used force to take Persephone, or at minimum participated in a scheme that violated her and Demeter's consent. Whether Zeus allowed it or not, the act remains stained. He punished with permanence that sometimes crossed the line between justice and cruelty. He treated the pleas of the living with indifference that can look like bullying, especially to those who are already weak. He allowed his loneliness to shape his decisions, and that loneliness, combined with authority, is always dangerous. Yet even these sins are part of his role, because if Hades were soft, the underworld would be exploited. If Hades were easily moved, heroes would turn death into a marketplace. If Hades were a god who loved applause, he would rule like Zeus, and the underworld would become another stage. Hades is not a stage. It is the basement of the cosmos, the foundation, the place where everything the world throws away is held and processed and stored. And because he is the foundation, Hades becomes the god who is blamed for weight. Mortals do not thank their foundations. They only notice them when they crack. So Hades does what a foundation must do. He does not crack. He endures. The underworld continues. Persephone continues her cycle. The dead continue arriving. The living continue telling stories that paint Hades as a villain or a romantic shadow, because both are easier than saying the truth. The truth is that Hades is a ruler who was formed by trauma, who chose necessity over glory, who built law to prevent chaos, and who loved in a way that was both real and flawed. He is a king who does not pretend to be gentle. He is a king who does not chase the sky. He is a king who sits in darkness, holding the world's endings so that life can continue above him. And if you listen closely beneath the horror, beneath the fear, beneath the whispers, you can hear the strange dignity of his reign. Not the dignity of celebration, the dignity of responsibility. The final image is not a monster with a whip. The final image is a quiet throne in a quiet hall. A crown that is not admired. A king who does not rise to greet applause. A king who waits, because everything, sooner or later, comes to him.